So in the previous modules, we've been seeing a lot of ways how what we say can be different than what we mean, or when we perform a locutionary act, it might perform a different illocutionary act, or things like that. Right? These are a lot of kind of different terms for very similar concepts. So far we have some understanding of what these different meanings are, but we still haven't really talked about how we get those meanings. Right? So once we hear something that someone has said, how do we figure out what they mean by that? Right, so that's going to be one of the major topics for the rest of the semester. And the fundamental idea that tries to explain how this works comes from a previous pragmatics researcher named H.P. Grice. He proposed this idea called the cooperative principle. I show it on the screen. It's kind of very wordy and sounds very technical, but essentially it's a fancy way of saying people cooperate with each other when they have a conversation, right? So when it's your turn to say something, you will say something that fits the conversation, that makes sense in the conversation, and that contributes to the conversation somehow. So this idea is meant to explain how we communicate with each other. The idea is that even if we're not cooperating for our other goals, then we still cooperate to have a conversation with each other. For example, if I go to a store and I'm trying to get a refund on something that I bought, and the person working at the store doesn't want to give me a refund, and we talk about it and we argue about it, we might have different goals. And we're not cooperating in that sense, right? I'm trying to get a refund and the other person's trying to not give me a refund, but we do still cooperate at having a conversation. We will say things that are relevant to that conversation, or we will say things that are responding to what the other person said, right? So this is the idea that people usually do this when they're having a conversation. And therefore, when we hear people say something, we interpret it with this assumption, right? When people say something, we assume that it is going to follow this principle. We assume that it's going to be relevant for the purpose of the conversation, right? So let me give you an example of how this might work to help us figure out what is meant. So this is an example from the TV show Breaking Bad. And in this one scene, this couple is visiting a house. If you've seen the show, then you know that like they don't have a lot of money. I think the man is a high school teacher at this point. I don't remember what he is at this point in the show, but he's a high school teacher without much money, and the woman is sort of a freelance writer or is selling things online. They don't have a lot of money. So they're looking at a house, and as they walk around a house, he just keeps criticizing it and saying, it's not big enough, it's not fancy enough, we're going to need a house with more rooms, we're going to need a house with a bigger backyard, and all of this stuff. So eventually he says, why should we buy a starter house when we're just going to have to move out in a year or two? And Skylar, the woman on the right, she responds by saying, did you win the lottery and not tell me? So if we interpret this literally, it seems not relevant, right? It doesn't seem like a direct answer to the question he's asking, right? If he's saying, why should we buy a starter house when we'll have to move out in a year or two, maybe she should give him some reasons why. But instead, she responds with a different question that's not even related to the house, right? So on the surface, it looks irrelevant. But if you're seeing this conversation, or if you're in this conversation, you will hear her say that, and you will assume that she's following the cooperative principle, right? You will assume that she's saying something that does fit the conversation and is relevant. So we will interpret it, we will reinterpret it in a way that makes it relevant to the conversation, right? In this case, the point she's making is we don't have enough money for all of those things, right? So her question isn't actually a question. It's a way to point out we don't have that much money, so why are you talking about this stuff? So this is an example of how people use the cooperative principle to figure out what is meant based on what is said, right? And the other important part of this idea is that to be able to do that, we can't just pay attention to the language part. We can't just pay attention to what the words mean and the syntax rules of how they go together and all of that. But we have to think about what the people in the conversation believe and what they want. and what they know and what they're trying to do. So this is the kind of reasoning that we need to take into account when we think about why did she say, did you win the lottery and not tell me? Why does anyone say anything? We can't just pay attention to what the words mean, but we have to think about what the person is trying to do and how that might be relevant to the conversation. So this is kind of the main idea that Grice proposed, and it's underlies a lot of the ideas that we will talk about throughout the rest of the semester. So over the next few modules, we will go into more detail about what this means and how we can use these ideas to figure out what is meant.